Saludos and greetings to all of you who are gathered here with MARCHA in this year of celebration of the 150th anniversary of the organizing of the first Methodist congregations in Mexico City in 1873. As you return to San Antonio this week, you're returning to the city where Reverend Elias Galman of California in 1970 convened a group of Hispanic Latino leaders to explore the possibility of forming a caucus within the United Methodist Church. In February of 1970, those gatherings, which took place at Pollard Memorial United Methodist Church, just about 3 or 4 miles from here, resulted in the naming of a steering committee, which was then to plan the first national convocation in El Paso in April of 1971. So we're aware that this is the 53rd year of the gathering of the steering committee in San Antonio and the 52nd year of the formal organization of MARCHA in 71. I want to thank Lisette, your president, for extending the invitation to make some remarks about Methodism in Mexico and especially the southwestern states of the U.S. for this gathering. I do want to note that Reverend and good brother of mine, good friend of mine, and dear brother of all of us, Edgar Avitia, was a major source of both some of the research that I used, as well as conversations with him about the development of Methodism in Mexico in the Southwest. Edgar was probably the best informed and the most devoted researcher about the story of Methodism over the last 150 years in Mexico and the Southwest. Dios lo tenga en paz. I also want to acknowledge Reverend Pedro Rubén Rivera, pastor, retired pastor living in El Paso, longtime pastor in Mexico of the Methodist Church, who wrote a book about the beginnings of Methodism as well. And Dr. John Pierre Bastian, former professor of the seminary in Mexico City. All of these good people were instrumental in leaving material and writing about the story that I'm going to share briefly. The year is 1824. There's a procession in downtown Mexico City, a religious procession, and there's a U.S. citizen who was working in Mexico, was a shoemaker, and the procession is coming by, and as was the custom, everyone was to kneel as the procession came by their place. And this onlooker from the U.S. Did not kneel, and one of the leaders of the procession insisted with him that he had to kneel, and he refused. And the leader of the procession took out his sword, and he became the first Protestant martyr in Mexico, according to the records from different sources. In that same year of 1824, by the same token, John C. Brigham of the British American Bible Society arrived in Mexico City to promote the distribution of Bibles in the language of the people, in Espanol. He had some success in making contacts and sharing his vision for sharing the scriptures with people in the different cities. And on his return to the American Bible Society headquarters, he shipped 500 Bibles to Mexico City to be distributed in the area. That was the beginning of the distribution of the scriptures in Spanish. Later in 1827, Dr. James Thompson of the British and Foreign Bible Society reaches Mexico. He came with the interest of distributing the Bible and the New Testament, but also to teach the Lancasterian educational program in Mexico. And Dr. Thompson, in 5 years, from 1827 to 1832, would distribute 3,200 Bibles and 4,200 New Testaments in the region. During the previous 3 centuries in New Spain, only 1,000 Bibles had been distributed in 3 centuries. So the distribution of the Bible became very key in laying the foundation and inviting people to be in touch with the whole biblical story, and especially the New Testament story about Jesus and the founding of the church. There was great receptivity among a growing segment of the population, particularly younger people, who were raising questions with the prevailing religious establishment, which was closely linked with the secular political establishment. So there was some tension, and that's where the distribution of the Bible began to have receptivity. In the meantime, north of the Rio Grande, particularly in Texas, by 1814, prior to 1824, when the first Bibles were distributed in Mexico, there were gatherings of Methodist societies that were coming across the Sabine and the Red River to settle in Texas. This was going to continue to grow after 1821, when Stephen F. Austin made an agreement with the Mexican government to establish some colonies in Texas. And they were expected to practice the Roman Catholic faith, but of course, some of the folks that came were Methodist. They had their Bible societies, and they began meeting in their homes and in gatherings in their farms, and Methodism began to be a factor in the religious life of the new colonists. In 1834, for example, before Texas broke away from Mexico, a layperson from New York State by the name of David Ayers, A-Y-E-R-S, who was a merchant and traveled back and forth, came and landed with a shipment of Bibles in Corpus Christi Bay as a part of his travels, and he continued on to San Patricio, which is a little town still there, a little village near Corpus Christi, and began distributing Bibles after consulting with the local priest. And the local priest said that was fine, that was a good thing. And so he was able to begin the distribution of the Bible with the cooperation of the local priest. Of course, the events in Texas of 1836, which resulted in Mexico losing territory when Texas declared independence, this event, which resulted in a transformation that was unexpected by the Mexican government, the U.S. Economic and political influence of the whole country was behind that movement, and it accelerated the Methodist mission into Texas because of the settling of many Methodists as people began coming south. We know, of course, that the influence of the slaveholding states of the South were a major factor in pressing for extending slaveholding territory in the South, and that was one of the factors that gave rise to the creation of Texas as an independent state. In the meantime, the Methodists keep making decisions and declaring intentions about expanding the mission into Mexico and Latin America. At the General Conference of 1832 in Philadelphia, the Methodist Episcopal Church, the conference voted to send missionaries to 3 nations, to Mexico, Liberia, and Brazil. Eventually, missionaries were sent to Liberia and Brazil, but not to Mexico, because the mission agency leaders decided it was too complicated because of political instability and religious intolerance. The freedom of worship was not allowed except the practice of the Roman Catholic tradition. During the 1840s, going a little further, during the presidency of Santa Anna, who was a president of Mexico after 1836, there was a resistance to the conservative nature of the government. More and more younger people continued to create a kind of an underground network of discussion about a different future for Mexico. Very interestingly, included in those groups were younger Roman Catholic clergy who are known as constitutional clerics. Here's a quote from our dear compañero, Reverend Avitia, about the constitutional clerics, and I quote, "The constitutional clerics were not just valiant and persistent, but strategic in seizing the opportunity to incarnate freedom of religion a la mexicana, in the midst of political turmoil. At the end of the day, several groups were organized out of that movement, but they didn't persist very long. But it was out of that leadership group, that kind of an underground network, that Methodism found some of the most devoted and committed people when they organized the churches. Some of those persons were Sóstenes Juárez, Agustín Palacios, and Arcadio Morales. And it is important that we claim this pre-1873 tradition, unquote. This is Edgar Avitia reminding us of the events that preceded the coming of the missionaries. Then we continue with the 1850s. With the election of Don Benito Juárez as president of Mexico, the first indigenous president of any nation in Latin America, the liberal political sector in the country began to work actively to invite and to encourage Protestant communions to initiate or expand efforts in Mexico. One key leader among many, Sóstenes Juárez, whom I've mentioned before, according to some sources, was actually a cousin of Don Benito Juárez, the president. In the French invasion of 1862, one of the soldiers brought a Bible with him, and we don't know all the circumstances, but Juárez, who was jailed for his resistance to the invasion, was gifted by that soldier with a Bible. And so Sóstenes became one of the early pastors later of the Methodist Episcopal Church South after 1873. So in the midst of the European invasion, the gospel that sets all of us free was shared with one who was in jail and was going to become a founding leader of Methodism in the beloved country of Mexico. Let me pause for a moment to make this comment. The long road to political change and resistance to the controlling influence of the established church led to the opening of Mexican society to religious, educational, and cultural change. I would emphasize the critical role of younger leaders inside and outside the church in creating public support and space for the Protestant churches in their mission outreach. Long before missionaries, bishops, and others began to organize and develop networks of congregations and schools and clinics and community centers, the groundwork had been laid, had been done by the committed minorities who gathered around the scriptures, shared their faith in small groups, and prayed fervently for a new future for their people. So the formal organizing of churches in Mexico City by the Methodists, by Bishop Butler of the Methodist Episcopal Church and Bishop John Keener of the Methodist Episcopal Church South in that same year in Mexico City, was preceded by all of that groundwork, all of that which was inspired and cultivated by leaders who embraced the messages of the gospel, the biblical message, and began to share it with family and friends in a variety of gatherings over many years. So Jean-Pierre Bastian comments about the strategy of Methodism and some of the ways in which it penetrated, if you will, or made a home in Mexico. And he talks about the gatherings in the sanctuary, how important it was to building community and sharing the good news, but also the establishment of schools. And almost in every location where there was a church, the pastor was expected to organize a school and make it available, especially to the children of the poor. And then they organized the temperance leagues. Temperance was a movement that Methodists were very strong in leading in the United States, and they carried that into Mexico, calling people to practice temperance and for the good of their families and their communities. And then Bastian says the newspapers, the sharing of stories, the sharing of events, the sharing of celebrations that people could read about and connect with. So these were some of the strategic efforts that helped the Methodists and other Protestants gain ground and be at home in Mexican life and culture. Now, in the meantime, north of the Rio Grande, in Texas, there was a conference organized in 1859, a little bit after the events I just described, in Goliad, Texas. It was a second conference organized in Texas by the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Goliad is about a 2-hour drive from San Antonio. Interestingly enough, the general who defeated the French at the Battle of Puebla on May the 5th, 1862, Ignacio Zaragoza, General Zaragoza, was born in Goliad when it was Mexican territory and eventually rose to the upper ranks of the military in Mexico. And then the conference that met in 1859 raised the possibility of expanding ministry among the Spanish-speaking population. And that began to happen through the distribution of Bibles and through the work of circuit riders who would have circuits and visit perhaps 8 or 10 locations and hold meetings, prayer meetings, do baptisms and the like. In fact, my maternal grandmother who was baptized by a circuit rider in Ciudad Mier, Tamaulipas, when she was just a little girl. An interesting event of the resistance to the French invasion in the 1860s by the Juarez regime was that there was a young soldier who had been a seminary student in Mexico. He had left the seminary after some time, not sure that he was called to be a priest. And when the invasion happened, he joined the Juarez armies of the resistance. In that time period, at some point, he finds himself on the Mexican border near Ciudad Mier, and he finds a book, don't know how he got hold of it, called Noches con los Romanistas, Nights with the Romanists. It was a book critical of the Catholicism, and he began to read and became interested in acquiring a Bible so he could read more about the texts that were cited and the stories that were lifted up out of Scripture. And he began to look for a Bible, travels down to Brownsville, eventually gets hold of a Bible, goes back to Mexico, committed to a new life in Christ and his own experience, and eventually winds up coming to Corpus Christi in 1870 and is invited by the First Methodist Church by a lay person by the name of William Hedden, Headen, who had a Bible study group at First Methodist Church in Spanish. And Alejo Hernandez, this young man, became the Bible teacher and eventually was granted a license to preach, or recommended for a license to preach, was granted that by the district. And on Christmas Eve, 1871, in the meeting of the West Texas Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church South at Leesville, Texas, and he was ordained a deacon by the bishop at that time. In 2006, I was able to organize, with the help of many others, a celebration of that event at the church in Leesville, although by then the church had been discontinued, but the building was still there, and we celebrated that event with representatives of the church in Mexico and representatives of United Methodism in this country, and Bishop Schnase came down from Missouri and was present and helped us in the dedication of the memorial that we left there. Later in 1874, as the 1870s continued north of the Rio Grande, a Mexican mission district was established in 1874, and later on there would be a border missionary conference that was organized in San Antonio in 1885 by the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which had 2 districts in northern Mexico and 2 districts in Texas. So the growth continued on both sides of the river, both in Mexico and in Texas, and eventually it would reach much further north into the states of New Mexico, into the states of Arizona and California. I want to make one brief closing comment. There's much more to share and much more comment to be made about the development of Methodism in Mexico and the Southwest. But I want to close with this brief comment. The missionary leaders and bishops are to be commended for making a commitment quite early to develop leadership for Methodism from the Mexican and Mexican-American congregations to lead the ministries into the future. And in 1881, for example, Reverend Santiago Tafoya, one of those early leaders, was appointed as the first Hispanic presiding elder in the history of United Methodism in this country. And he eventually became a pastor in my hometown of Seguin, in my home church, and died preaching in the pulpit in December of 1911. But it's important to make this connection. The early developments in Mexico, gatherings around the Bible, the work of the constitutional clerics, the gathering of people in similar fashion to the Methodist societies, really gave rise and set the stage for the missionary engagement that came later on. And the continued growth of Methodism south of the Rio Grande and north of the Rio Grande also was led, and it was critically important that Mexican and Mexican-American leaders be on the front lines of that. I think that's what we need to continue into God's future. The future comes from those in the pew, if you will, who step forward, answer the call, and become engaged in frontline ministry. I commend MARCHA for its continuing mission of reminding the denomination and calling us all to faithful witness to Christ. Bendiciones, blessings to all of you.